Hello, my name is Tim Congdon. I'm economic spokesman for the UK Independence Party. Over the next few minutes I'm going to talk about the Eurozone crisis. This is really particularly for UKIP members, but I hope it may be of wider interest too. Of course, we're opposed to the membership of the European Union, and one of the triumphs of the Eurosceptic cause has been to keep Britain out of the Eurozone and to keep the pound. I think that the events of 2011 have shown how wise we were to keep the pound. But what I want to do just in the next few minutes is to explain what's going wrong in the Eurozone and how it may affect us in 2012 and perhaps even years after that. The trouble goes right back to the start. Back in the early 1990s, the European bureaucrats and politicians who put this structure, this single currency together, had forgotten some basic features of every banking system. A central bank is supposed to be able to lend to governments, it's banker to the government, and it's also a banker to the banking system. Central banks don't lend to you and I, and we can't keep deposits at the Bank of England, but a central bank is banker to the government and banker to the banking system. Or at least in theory it is. In the Eurozone, this was always left terribly unclear, and the Maastricht Treaty of 1992 really didn't spell out what was supposed to happen in this area of public policy at all. When the single currency came in 1999, global conditions, financial conditions were perfect. And there's a rapidly expanding interbank market. So banks in Greece and Portugal could borrow on a large scale from banks in Singapore or China or Saudi Arabia, and they did. They borrowed very heavily. This was fine while it was going on, but in 2007 it came to a stop. And ever since then, the Eurozone crisis has been getting worse. Essentially, the banks in the so-called PIGS countries, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain, but also banks in other countries too, can't borrow from the banks that they could borrow it in before 2007, and they need to go instead to the central bank. I said at the start that the normal job of a central bank was to banker to banking systems and banker to the government. So you've got these banks who can't finance their assets. They have to go to the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank thinks it's not its job to lend to banks in Greece and Italy and Spain, and so very understandably it's been very difficult about increasing its exposures to these rather risky banks. If the Greek banks can't borrow to finance their assets, the Greek banks can't then buy Greek government securities. The Portuguese banks can't fund their assets, they can't buy Portuguese government securities. So what's happened is, as the banks have got to limit their own activities, they've been selling government bonds, government bond prices have been rising, and the governments then say, they go to the European Central Bank, can we borrow from you please? And the ECB says, well, yes and no, maybe some, but we can't lend to you without limit. And this is the crux of the problem now facing the Eurozone. The governments can't borrow easily from financial markets, the banks can't borrow from each other, they can't borrow from banks outside the Eurozone, and you have a terrible mess. It's worse than that, because there are some strong banks in Europe, but they hold Greek government bonds and Italian government bonds and so on. And if they were to mark, so-called mark-to-market, if they were to express in their accounts these government bonds at their true market value, these banks would be bust. And I mean quite important banks in Germany, France and so on. How does this affect us? It affects us because our own banks have got claims on European banks, and they've got to worry about that they could lose money on the loans they've made to Eurozone banks. It affects us also because as the Eurozone banks shrink their balance sheets, they destroy the amount of money in the economy, and that causes a recession. And obviously, because the Eurozone is important to us, that then affects economic activities economic activity in the UK. I think the critical thing now is that the central banks, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, must help the banks, however much they dislike the bankers, they must help the banks. And what's really vital is that we don't repeat the mistake of late 2008. Remember back in late 2008, Lehman went bust, the banks had problems around the world, and governments and regulators demanded that the banks recapitalize themselves very quickly. So you had that traumatic period for bank shareholders in the final weeks and opening weeks, final weeks of 2008, opening weeks of 2009. We mustn't go through that again. The banks must be given a long time to recapitalize. At any rate, when we look back on all this years from now, I think we'll be able to conclude that Britain was lucky to stay outside the Eurozone and to keep the pound. At the end of the day, we can manage our own economy regardless of what's happening in the Eurozone. Our banks are going to be affected by the crisis there, but we must avoid further entanglement with the Eurozone, keep our currency, and as far as possible, try and look after our own affairs to our own advantage. Above all, we must make preparations over time to leave the European Union. The single currency has been a disaster for the image of European integration. It's a disaster for Europe at the moment. We're lucky to have stayed outside. We must stay outside. Thank you.